My name is Dennis Shirley. I am a professor of education at the Lynch School of Education at Boston College in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Educational Change. I'd like to share with you some reflections on two books that I've written with my friend and colleague Andy Hargreaves. The first one is called The Fourth Way, The Inspiring Future for Educational Change, and the second is called The Global Fourth Way, The Quest for Educational Excellence. Both books attempt to describe an alternative way of thinking about education and educational change than that which is practiced in many countries around the world. Many schools and school systems have been implementing more standardized curricula, more high-stakes testing, more results-oriented intervention programs in schools, and in many contexts these are increasingly draconian in scope. They can culminate in schools being closed, the principal being fired, all of the staff having to reapply for their jobs, and ultimately the public schools being closed altogether and being turned over to alternative providers. We're seeing a flurry of innovations now that are taking place in the for-profit sector, cyber schooling, and any number of other venues. But the majority of children around the world are still attending traditional public schools. And so those of us that are concerned with the fate of a rising generation have to ask ourselves, what can we do to uplift performance and infuse innovation into public school systems around the world? This is where the fourth way comes in. One of the things that we suffer from in education is collective amnesia about our past. So I'm going to give you a thumbnail sketch of three recent ways of change and then an indication of what a more promising fourth way of change might entail. Let's go back to the 1960s. For those of us that are older in the profession, we remember the 1960s as a time when teachers had lots of individualism. If you wanted to think of teaching as an independent craft, which you as an artisan could display in the classroom, the 1960s were your decade. You could be like a Robin Williams type and have your kids tear the first page out of a textbook. You could choose broadly and creatively what kinds of materials you wanted your kids to interact with. And there were no standardized tests, such as are now common around the world today, that students needed to take to move to a higher level or that were used to rate and rank teachers in schools. Consider that, if you would, a first way of change. Lots of independence, lots of innovation, but not much system-level coherence and very little accountability. A second wave of change then began in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan in the US, Maggie Thatcher in the UK, and with the educational reforms of Augusto Pinochet in Chile also. In this second wave of change, there was a lot of ranking of schools, lots of competition, standards-based reforms, and if the standards didn't seem to take hold, now market-based models of reform were infused into the system with what were called academies in England or called charter schools in the US. So the idea is that all schools would have to meet consistent standards, and if the public schools failed in this domain, then there would be competition brought into the public system through what are called diverse provider models of change. So educators went from having a lot of freedom, a lot of professional discretion, to now having to rally to meet common standards. Standards were, in general, popular among teachers. They appreciated the coherence and the consistency, but they weren't entirely aware at the time the onward momentum that the standards would take, and that they would escalate one day towards standardization of teaching and of learning. So the 1980s brought a kind of a cold wind through the education profession as increasingly business-borrowed metrics of accountability and competition were infused into the sector. By the time we get up to the late 1990s, or the beginning of the new century, under Tony Blair in the UK, under Clinton and Bush in the US, we're increasingly moving towards a third way of change, which is data-driven decision-making powered through networks across schools and across systems. In this third way of change, the standards become turbocharged, and now the data become the point of departure for all decisions about every aspect of school improvement or innovation. This is the era of No Child Left Behind in the U.S. and Every Child Matters in England. And what happens now is that educators are increasingly losing the discretion that they once had back in the 1960s, the adaptive forms of professionalism they had in the 1980s with the second way, and education is becoming more and more of a data-driven enterprise. What this means for classroom teachers and for students in schools, however, is a loss of freedom, loss of autonomy, loss of creativity, loss of independence, increasingly micromanaged, script-driven approaches to the improvement of teaching and learning that leads to not really much improvement in results in the U.S. and England, and a sense of professional loss of momentum and morale. Hence we get to the issue, can we get beyond first-way licentiousness, second-way standard-drivenness, third-way data-drivenness, to something broader, something more imaginative, something more exciting for our young people and for the professionals that are in daily interaction with them? What would that be? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not entirely sure that I know, and that's why Andy Hargreaves and I don't prescribe what a fourth way of change could look like, but rather we attempt to provide pointers for practice. The pointers for practice that we now draw on in our most recent book, which looks at Finland, Singapore, Ontario, and Alberta in Canada, high-achieving school in England, and a high-achieving network in California. The fourth way, we suggest, will restore integrity and autonomy and freedom to the profession within boundaries, within constraints. We will still need to maintain some standards which have been popular with the public and with the professional, but we won't be so data-driven and we won't be so micromanaged. We'll have space for students to re-explore some of the great traditions of progressive education in the U.S. and around the world, where students can initiate their own projects with teachers who are caring, reflective, globally engaged, technologically savvy, but not technologically promiscuous. We use technology to help the kids to engage in learning that is deep, profound, personally meaningful, socially relevant, environmentally sustainable. To know more about these concepts, I encourage you to take a look at the two books, The Fourth Way and The Global Fourth Way. A video like this can't capture all the complexity of the arguments, but I do ask you to think seriously about the path that we're now on with educational change globally, in your country, in your system, in your school, in your classroom, because really the state of the world is in the balance. We have to find ways to recalibrate education, re-engage our young people, uplift the profession, and to build a better world. Thank you for your time.